You're sitting in a coffee shop, and everyone around you is either in conversation or glancing at their phones between sips. You've got your notebook open, or maybe just your thoughts, and you're perfectly content in your own company. Then someone you vaguely know spots you and approaches with that particular expression of concern. "Are you here alone?" they ask, as if you've been abandoned. You smile and say yes, and they immediately offer to join you, as though solitude is a problem that needs solving. Here's what's interesting about that moment. The person approaching you assumes they're being kind. They've been conditioned to see aloneness as something sad, something incomplete. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most creative parts of your mind only wake up when no one else is around? We've built an entire social framework around the idea that connection is always good and isolation is always concerning. We celebrate collaboration, we romanticize partnerships, we design offices with open floor plans because surely more contact means more ideas. And on some level that makes sense. Humans are social creatures. We need each other. But somewhere along the way we stopped distinguishing between loneliness and solitude. We started treating them as the same thing. Loneliness is the ache of unwanted separation. Solitude is the choice to step back. One depletes you, the other replenishes you. And when it comes to creativity, that distinction matters more than most people realize. Think about the last time you had a truly original idea. Not something you borrowed or adapted, but something that felt like it came from somewhere deeper. Chances are you weren't in the middle of a brainstorming session. You were probably alone, maybe in the shower, maybe on a walk, maybe lying in bed just before sleep when your mind finally had permission to wander. There's a reason for that. Creativity isn't just about having ideas. It's about creating the conditions where ideas can emerge. And those conditions require something our modern world desperately lacks: uninterrupted mental space. When you're alone, your brain shifts into a different mode. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, and it activates when you're not focused on any external task. It's the mental state of daydreaming, of letting your mind drift without direction. And here's the fascinating part. This is when your brain starts making unexpected connections. It pulls together memories, concepts, fragments of thought that have nothing to do with each other, and suddenly something clicks. That's not laziness, that's deep cognitive work. But the default mode network doesn't activate when you're socially engaged. It can't. Social interaction requires a different kind of attention. You're reading facial expressions, modulating your tone, tracking the flow of conversation, anticipating responses. All of that is important, but it's also cognitively demanding. It keeps you oriented outward. And creativity, real creativity, requires you to turn inward. This isn't a new observation. History is full of creators who understood this instinctively. Virginia Woolf wrote an entire essay about the necessity of having a room of one's own. Not just for practical reasons, but because the creative mind needs a space where it isn't performing for anyone. Nikola Tesla spent hours alone walking through the streets of New York, letting his mind churn through problems without distraction. Maya Angelou rented a small hotel room with nothing in it but a bed, a table, and a bottle of sherry, and she'd go there every morning to write in complete solitude. They weren't avoiding people, they were protecting the fragile early stages of the creative process, because that's when ideas are most vulnerable. Before they're fully formed, before they're tested or articulated, they need quiet, they need room to breathe. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes with being around others, even people you love. It's not malicious, it's just a natural byproduct of social existence. You start editing yourself. You become aware of how you're being perceived. You adjust, and that adjustment, however subtle, pulls you out of the deep, unself-conscious state where creativity lives. Researchers have actually studied this. In one experiment, participants were asked to generate creative ideas either alone or in groups. The groups were louder, more energetic, more confident, but when the ideas were evaluated afterward, the people who worked alone consistently produced more ideas, and more original ones. The group dynamic, for all its enthusiasm, had created a kind of invisible ceiling. People were unconsciously converging toward the middle, toward what felt safe and acceptable. Solitude removes that ceiling. When you're alone, there's no one to impress, no one to convince, no implicit standard you're trying to meet. You can follow a thought all the way to its strange, awkward, half-formed conclusion without worrying whether it makes sense to anyone else. And that freedom, that permission to be weird in private, is where originality comes from.
But let's pause here for a moment, because there's a difference between choosing solitude for creative work and using solitude to avoid something uncomfortable. And that distinction is worth paying attention to. If you find yourself consistently withdrawing, not because you want space to think, but because connection feels threatening or exhausting in a way that leaves you more drained than restored, that's different. That's not about protecting your creativity, that's about something else, and it might be worth exploring with curiosity rather than judgment. Solitude should feel nourishing. It should give you energy, not just take it from the world. Healthy solitude has a rhythm to it. You step away, you create, you reflect, and then you return. You bring what you've discovered back into conversation, back into collaboration, because the goal isn't to disappear. The goal is to go deep enough that you have something real to offer when you reemerge. There's also a cultural dimension to this that we don't talk about enough. Western culture, particularly American culture, tends to valorize extroversion. The ideal person is outgoing, socially confident, always ready to network. We've built entire industries around this idea. But many Eastern philosophies have long understood the value of withdrawal. The concept of Wu Wei in Taoism, for example, emphasizes effortless action, the idea that sometimes the most productive thing you can do is stop trying so hard and let things unfold naturally. That only happens in stillness, in silence. Even within Western thought, there's a long tradition of valuing solitude. The Stoics believed that true clarity came from spending time alone with your thoughts. Montaigne retreated to his library to write essays that were, essentially, extended conversations with himself. These weren't people running away from life. They were people who understood that depth requires distance. And yet, when you choose solitude today, you're often met with suspicion. People assume you're depressed or antisocial or going through something difficult. They don't consider that you might just be working on something that requires your full, undivided attention, that you might be building something quietly, patiently, in a way that can't happen in the noise. There's also something to be said about the quality of ideas that emerge from solitude versus the quality of ideas that emerge from collaboration. Collaboration is excellent for refining ideas, for testing them, for building on what already exists. But the initial spark, the thing that makes you stop and say, wait, what if? That almost always happens when you're alone, because that spark requires a kind of psychological safety that's hard to find in groups. It requires the freedom to be wrong, to be strange, to follow a thread that might lead nowhere. When you're alone, you're not just thinking differently, you're thinking more honestly. You're not unconsciously tailoring your thoughts to fit the expectations of the room. You're not second-guessing yourself before you've even finished the thought. You're just thinking, and that unfiltered, unperformed version of your mind is often the most interesting one. Of course, this doesn't mean you should never collaborate. Some of the best creative work happens when solitary thinking meets collaborative refinement. But the sequence matters. If you skip the solitary part and jump straight into collaboration, you're not bringing your deepest ideas to the table. You're bringing the safest ones, the ones that already feel socially acceptable. And safe ideas rarely move anything forward. So what does this mean for you, practically speaking? It means you might need to start treating solitude not as something that happens by accident, but as something you actively create space for. Not because you're avoiding people, but because you're honoring the part of your mind that only speaks when no one else is listening. It means recognizing that the discomfort you feel when you're alone, if you feel it, might not be a sign that something's wrong. It might just be the unfamiliarity of hearing your own thoughts without distraction. We're so used to filling every silence with noise, with stimulation, with other people's voices, that our own inner voice can feel foreign. But that voice is worth listening to. It knows things the rest of you hasn't caught up to yet. Being alone doesn't make you more creative because it's peaceful or pleasant, though it can be both. It makes you more creative because it removes the need to perform. It gives your mind permission to go places it wouldn't go if someone were watching. And in those places, in the strange, quiet corners of your own thinking, that's where the most interesting ideas are waiting. So maybe the question isn't whether you're comfortable being alone. Maybe the question is whether you trust what happens when you are. If this resonates with you, the next video explores why some people need less external validation than others, and what that reveals about how different minds find meaning. And after that, we'll talk about why overthinking isn't always the problem people make it out to be.